Chapter 2. A Dream Life Shattered. The path Joe followed down to the Shell House that afternoon was only the last few hundred yards of a much longer, harder, and at times darker journey. Joe was the second son of Harry Rance and Nellie Maxwell. Harry was a big man, well over 6 feet tall, large in the hands and feet. He was a tinkerer and inventor, a dreamer of big dreams. In his spare time, he loved to work with his hands and build contraptions of all kinds. He fiddled with machines, took apart mechanical devices in order to understand them. He even designed and built his own version of an automobile from scratch. Nellie Maxwell was a piano teacher and the daughter of a preacher. They had their first child, Fred, in 1899. 7 years later, looking for a place where Harry could make his mark on the world, they headed west from Pennsylvania, crossed the country, and settled down in Spokane, Washington. The town was surrounded by ponderosa pine forest and open range country. The summers were crackling hot, the air dry and perfumed with the vanilla scent of ponderosa bark. In the autumn, towering dust storms would blow in from the wheat country to the west. The winters were bitter cold, the springs stingy and slow in coming. The Rance family moved into a small frame house on the north side of the cold, clear Spokane River, and Joe was born there in March of 1914. Harry set up an automobile shop. Each morning he rose at 4:30 to go to work, and often he didn't return home until well after 7 in the evening. It was hard work, but his business did well, and he was able to buy his family nice things. Nellie taught piano to neighborhood children and doted on her sons, lavishing love on them and watching over them carefully. On Sunday mornings, the family attended church together, then spent the day relaxing. Sometimes they just walked into town to buy freshly made peach or strawberry ice cream. Sometimes they drove out to a nearby lake where they could rent boats and explore the shoreline, or spend a hot afternoon swimming or sitting on the grassy banks enjoying a picnic. But the best part for Joe was when they went to Natatorium Park in the cool shade of the cottonwood trees down by the river. Something interesting and fun was always going on there. They could watch a baseball game or listen to a John Philip Sousa band concert. What Joe particularly loved was when his parents would put him on the park's spectacular new carousel and he could ride, whirling around and around on the back of a carved tiger or elegant horse under the carousel's dazzling lights. But when Joe was just about to turn 4, this dream life shattered. His memories of what happened next were a kaleidoscope of broken images. He remembered his mother standing by his side in an overgrown field, coughing violently into a handkerchief, and the handkerchief turning bright red with blood. He remembered a doctor with a black leather bag. He remembered sitting on a hard church pew, swinging his legs while his mother lay in a box at the front of the church and would not get up. He remembered lying on a bed with his big brother, Fred, perched on the edge. He remembered Fred talking softly about dying and about angels and about needing to go to college and about how Joe would have to go east to stay with relatives in Pennsylvania. He remembered sitting quietly alone on a train for long days and nights, with blue mountains and green muddy fields and rusty rail yards and dark cities full of smokestacks, all flashing past the window by his seat. He remembered meeting a woman who had said she was his aunt, Alma, and then, almost immediately, becoming terribly sick. He remembered lying for weeks in a bed in an unfamiliar attic room, with the shades always pulled. No Ma, no Pa, no Fred. Only the lonely sound of a train now and then, and a strange room spinning around him. Plus the beginnings of a new heaviness, a feeling of doubt and fear pressing down on his small shoulders and congested chest. As he lay ill with scarlet fever, in the attic of a woman he did not really know, the world he had known back in Spokane dissolved. His brother had gone off to finish college. His mother was dead of cancer. His father had fled to Canada, unable to cope with his wife's terrible death. A little more than a year later, in the summer of 1919, his brother called for him, and 5-year-old Joe rode the train back across the country again all by himself. Although he was only 20, Fred had married and found a good job, and he took care of his little brother for the next 2 years. By that point, their father, Harry, had returned from Canada married a young woman named Thula La Follette, and built a new house in Spokane. For Joe, that meant still more change. Soon he was moving to another new home, living with a father he hardly remembered and a stepmother he did not know at all. But at least it was a real home, and in time this new life began to feel normal. The house was spacious and well lit. Out back there was a swing with a wide seat big enough for him and his father, and Thula to ride 3 at a time on warm summer nights. He could walk to school, cutting through a field where he would sometimes snatch a sweet ripe melon for an after-school snack. He dug long, elaborate underground tunnels in the vacant lots nearby, and spent long, cool afternoons in them, escaping Spokane's searing, dry summer heat. And the new house was always filled with music. Harry had kept Nellie's most precious possession, her piano, and he delighted in sitting at the keys with Joe. Harry pounded out popular tunes as his son, perched on the bench next to him, gleefully sang along. Although she was an accomplished violinist, Thula did not join in. She didn't like the often corny music Harry and Joe chose, and she was not particularly happy to have Nellie's piano in her house. In January 1922, Harry and Thula had a boy named Harry Jr., and the following year they had another son, Mike. With his family growing and more mouths to feed, Harry had to take a job at a gold mine in Idaho, some 140 miles away. He'd work there during the week, then make the long drive home on the weekends. During one of those weekend visits, in the middle of a dark, moonless night, 9-year-old Joe suddenly awoke to the smell of smoke. He heard flames crackling somewhere in the house. He snatched up baby Mike, grabbed Harry Jr., and stumbled out of the house with his little half-brothers. His father and Thula burst out of the house in singed nightclothes a few moments later. Once he saw that his boys were safe, Harry dashed back into the smoke and flames. Several minutes passed before he reappeared. With the fire raging behind him, he was pushing Nellie's piano inch by inch out through a garage door. He had risked his life to save the last thing he had left from his first marriage. Now, as Joe stood and watched their house burn to the ground, he had that same feeling he'd experienced in his aunt's dark attic years before. The same coldness, fear, and insecurity. Home, it was beginning to seem to him, was something you couldn't necessarily count on. Chapter 3. 1001 Small Things. The Washington Shell House would eventually become a kind of home to Joe Rance. But on the first day of practice, he and the other freshmen did not even row. The afternoon was largely consumed by the collection of facts and figures. Joe and Roger and all the other hopefuls were told to step onto scales, to stand next to measuring sticks, to fill out forms detailing their medical backgrounds. Assistant coaches and older students carrying clipboards stood by, eyeing them and recording the information. Few of the young men assembled outside the Shell House that afternoon had ever rowed a stroke in their lives. Most of the freshmen were city boys, but a few, like Joe, were farm boys or lumberjacks or fishermen. They came from foggy coastal villages, damp dairy farms, and smoky lumber towns all over Washington state. Growing up, they had wielded axes and fishing gaffs and pitchforks, building up powerful arms and broad shoulders. They were strong, and the coaches knew their strength would help those boys, but they also knew rowing was at least as much art as brawn. There were 1001 small things that had to be learned and performed in precisely the right way to propel one of those narrow shells through the water with speed and grace. Over the next few months, the few boys who made the team would need to master every last one of those 1001 small things. And in those few months, some essential questions would be answered. Would the farm boys be able to keep up with the intellectual side of the sport? Would the city boys have the toughness to survive? The freshman coach, Tom Bowles, was in charge that day. He would be the one to decide which 9 boys would make the first freshman boat. But another man stood quietly in the broad doorway of the Shell House. He was tall, with cold slate-gray eyes, and he was dressed impeccably in a dark 3-piece business suit, a crisp white shirt, and a tie. His name was Al Ulbrichtson, and he was the head coach of the rowing program. Ulbrichtson was known as the least talkative man on campus. Some of the local sports reporters called him the man with the stone face. He did not like to show his emotions, but he knew the sport of rowing well. He had been the lead rower or stroke oar of a Washington crew that had won national championships in 1924 and 1926. The college had quickly hired him as a coach after graduation. Now, rowing was the center of his life and almost a religion to him. The new boys sauntered along the dock, getting a feel for the long yellow spruce oars. Many of the freshmen, Albrechtsen noted, looked fit. As a group, they were tall and moved gracefully. Albrechtsen was pleased by what he saw. When Bowles and his assistant coaches released the boys for the day, Joe Rance and all the rest straggled up the hill toward the campus. They moved in small groups, shaking their heads, talking softly among themselves about their chances of making the team. Albrechtsen stood on the floating dock, listening to the lake water lap at the shore, watching the boys leave. He was studying them closely because he was thinking well beyond the upcoming season. The previous year had been a strong one for the Washington team. They defeated their arch rivals from the University of California, then beat out the best crews the East had to offer, including Yale, Cornell, and Harvard. But Albrechtsen was not satisfied. In 1932, a crew from California had won Olympic gold. No Washington coach had ever even come close to taking a team to the Olympics. The next games were set to take place in Berlin, Germany, in 1936. And Al Albrechtsen didn't just want to get a crew there, he wanted to bring gold home to Seattle. To pull it off, the coach knew he was going to have to clear a series of imposing hurdles. He'd have to outsmart Cal coach Kai Ebright, who was widely regarded as the intellectual master of the sport. Ebright had an uncanny knack for winning the big races, the ones that really counted. Albrechtsen needed to find a crew that could beat Ebright's best when it mattered most. Then that crew would have to outrace the top boats from the East at the Olympic trials. Finally, if they did earn the right to represent the United States, they'd face the best oarsmen in the world. They would have to beat the British, who had practically invented the sport, the Italians, who had nearly won in 1932, and the Germans, who under the new Nazi system were said to be building extraordinarily powerful and disciplined crews. Before he could get to Germany, though, Albrechtsen had to find the 9 young men who would make up his crew. He wondered if any of those green and untested boys he had just watched on the dock might meet his strict qualifications. They'd need raw power, superhuman stamina, and solid intelligence to master the details of rowing technique. But they would need something else as well, something even more important. To be part of that kind of crew, a gold medal crew, each young man would also have to be able to put aside his own personal ambitions. He'd have to throw his ego over the side of the boat, to leave it swirling in the wake of his shell. He'd need to pull not just for himself, not just for glory, but for the other boys in the boat.